The air in the subterranean archive was a constant, cool breath, filtered and recycled, carrying the faint scent of aged paper and dry dust. Blake moved with a practiced economy, each step precise on the polished concrete floor. His world was one of meticulous order, a vast labyrinth of shelves housing generations of forgotten records. Here, deep within an underground bunker carved into the granite of a desolate mountain pass, he found a quiet solace in the systematic preservation of the past. Today, Blake was tasked with processing a collection recently acquired from a defunct historical society, a series of crates marked miscellaneous uncategorized. He placed the first wooden box onto his steel workstation, the metal legs groaning softly under the weight. With a pry bar, he carefully lifted the lid, revealing layers of yellowed newsprint protecting an assortment of forgotten objects. There were tarnished silver spoons, a child's porcelain doll missing an eye, and a stack of brittle ledgers bound in decaying leather. Blake donned his archival gloves, his movements deliberate. He logged each item, documenting its condition, estimated age, and any identifying marks. The work was slow, demanding unwavering focus, and Blake thrived on it. The world outside, with its shifting uncertainties and chaotic currents, faded away in the face of such clear, definable tasks. He worked through the afternoon, the low hum of the ventilation system a steady companion. The ledgers, mostly mundane records of trade and property transactions from a forgotten coastal town, offered no surprises. He catalogued a collection of pressed wildflowers, their colors faded to ghostly impressions, and then a series of geological samples, unremarkable chunks of quartz and granite. His determination to complete the task before the end of his shift pushed him forward. As he reached the bottom of the fourth crate, his gloved fingers brushed against something unlike anything else he had encountered. It was small, roughly the size of a pigeon's egg, and incredibly dense. He lifted it out, rotating it under the beam of his desk lamp. The object was a dull, featureless black, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. Its surface was smooth, yet somehow also rough, like polished obsidian that had been eroded by eons of wind and sand. But there were no facets, no sharp edges, just an unsettling organic smoothness that hinted at no clear origin. It felt cold, colder than the ambient temperature of the bunker, and the chill seemed to penetrate the thick fabric of his gloves, a subtle, insistent intrusion. Blake's brow furrowed. He placed the object on a clean sheet of white archival paper. It didn't roll, it settled with an unnatural stillness, as if gravity exerted a stronger pull on it than on anything else in the room. He checked the crate for any accompanying notes, any scrap of paper that might identify this anomaly. Nothing. No provenance, no description, no date. It was simply there, nestled amongst the detritus of a forgotten past. His internal clock, usually so precise, seemed to stutter. He glanced at the wall-mounted digital display, 1637. He had been so immersed that the time had slipped past unnoticed. This object, however, demanded his full, undivided attention. He retrieved a magnifying glass. Under magnification, the surface of the black object offered no discernible texture, no microscopic imperfections. It was a perfect, seamless void. A strange sensation prickled at the back of his neck, a faint hum that vibrated not in his ears, but somewhere deeper, behind his eyes. He blinked, shaking his head slightly. The hum persisted, a phantom vibration. Blake picked up the object again. He felt a peculiar pressure, as if the air around it was denser, heavier. He held it closer, examining it for any seam or inscription. There was nothing. Just the featureless, light-devouring black. A flicker at the edge of his vision. He snapped his head up. The fluorescent lights overhead, usually a steady, unwavering glow, seemed to waver, their edges blurring for a fraction of a second. He looked away from the object, focusing on the pristine white walls of the bunker. Everything was sharp, defined. He looked back at the object. The hum intensified, a low thrumming that resonated in his teeth. Blake, ever the archivist, sought to categorize, to understand. He tried to recall any material, any geological formation, that matched its properties. Volcanic glass? Meteorite? He had handled countless unusual specimens in his career, but this defied every classification. The air, once cool and neutral, now seemed to carry a faint, metallic tang. He sniffed, trying to place it. No, not metallic. Something else. Something ancient and dry, like dust from a forgotten star. The thought, unbidden and unsettling, startled him. He was an archivist, not an astronomer. His mind was usually so grounded, so tethered to facts and tangible evidence. He set the object down again, carefully. As it made contact with the paper, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the workstation. Or perhaps it was his hand. He stared at the object, then at his hand, then at the object again. His breath hitched. The digital clock on the wall now read 1642, but the numbers seemed to shimmer, their solid lines briefly fracturing into a kaleidoscope of tiny, impossible geometries before snapping back into place. It was not the fear of danger, but the profound unease of something fundamentally wrong. This object, this simple, inert black thing, was somehow distorting his perception, challenging the very bedrock of his reality. But then, the archivist in him, the determined preserver, fought back. He had to understand it. Even if it defied all categories. He pulled a fresh, acid-free evidence bag from a drawer. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the object. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, and the phantom hum behind his eyes became a persistent throb. The air in the subterranean archive, once a comforting constant, now felt like a held breath, stagnant and heavy. Blake sat hunched over the artifact, his fingers tracing its unsettling contours. It was not merely old, it felt older than anything he had ever catalogued, a dense, dark stone, impossibly smooth in places, impossibly rough in others. Its surface was etched with lines that were not quite symbols, not quite patterns, but something in between, shifting subtly under the harsh glare of his desk lamp. He had spent the last 72 hours in a self-imposed siege, the archive's silence amplifying the frantic hum of his own thoughts. He ignored the faint chime of the door to the main hall, signaling a colleague's departure or arrival. His world had shrunk to the radius of this table, this object, and the increasingly desperate search for context within the archive's vast holdings. He pulled a heavy tome closer, its brittle pages releasing a puff of ancient dust. Its title, barely legible, spoke of forgotten rituals and geological anomalies in a dialect no longer in common use. He cross-referenced the vague geographical markers mentioned within with a series of topographical maps, their paper yellowed and cracking. The lines on the artifact, he now suspected, were not merely decorative. They were a map. A distorted, impossible map. His eyes burned, gritty and dry. Sleep had become a luxury he could not afford, each attempt to rest bringing fragmented images of the artifact's patterns shifting across his eyelids, accompanied by a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in his bones, though no sound was truly present. He felt it, a pressure behind his eyes, a dull ache in his jaw from clenching it. The text spoke of the confluence of the unheard, the place where the veil thins. Blake scoffed aloud, a dry, humorless sound. He was an archivist of facts, of tangible history, not obscure mysticism. Yet, the precision of the cross-references was undeniable. The symbol on the maps, the cryptic descriptions, and the artifact's own internal geometry pointed with an unnerving coherence. A tremor ran through him, not of fear, but of a desperate, urgent curiosity. And the longer he stared at the artifact, the more his internal compass spun. Was he truly seeing connections, or was the object subtly rewiring his perception? He packed a small bag, his movements stiff and automatic. He didn't inform a supervisor, nor did he leave a note for any colleagues. The urgency of his investigation had superseded all protocol, all professional decorum. The mountain pass was a desolate stretch of road, flanked by towering, jagged peaks that seemed to claw at the sky. A fierce, relentless wind howled through the crags, carrying with it the scent of pine and ice. Blake pulled the vehicle to the shoulder, the tires crunching on loose gravel. He stepped out, immediately assaulted by the biting wind. The sky above was a bruised purple, the first hint of dawn barely painting the eastern horizon. He clutched the artifact, now wrapped in a thick cloth, his knuckles white. The air here vibrated with an unnatural stillness beneath the wind's shriek. He looked out at the valley, and for a terrifying, impossible moment, the distant peaks seemed to breathe. The very landscape rippled, as if the solid rock and ancient trees were merely a thin curtain, fluttering in an unseen current. His breath caught in his throat. The patterns on the artifact, which had seemed abstract in the archive, now mirrored the impossible undulations of the valley floor, the jagged lines on its surface aligning with the impossible, shifting contours of the mountains. His mind reeled. This wasn't a trick of the light, nor a hallucination born of fatigue. This was a direct, undeniable perception, raw and unfiltered. The world was not what he had understood it to be. The mountains, solid and eternal, were merely an illusion, a surface tension on something vast and incomprehensible beneath. He was not merely observing, he was seeing the fabric fray, the cosmic weave unraveling before his very eyes. The artifact was not a map of the world, but a key to its true, terrifying nature. Blake's fingers, calloused from years of cataloging ancient texts and brittle documents, trembled as they traced the unsettling contours of the artifact. It was a dense, dark stone, impossibly old, not merely in geological terms, but with an age that seemed to predate the very concept of time. The air, once a comforting constant, was a held breath, stagnant and heavy, pressing down on him. He had spent days, perhaps weeks, since unearthing it. Time had blurred. Sleep was a forgotten luxury, replaced by a restless, gnawing compulsion. It whispered, not with words, but with an insistent urge. It demanded a different environment, a place of stark exposure. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. He wrapped the stone in heavy canvas, the material doing little to mute its strange resonance. The journey from the archive was a blur of frantic preparation and disoriented navigation. The destination was clear, etched into his mind with an alarming specificity, the mountain pass. He remembered it from old, brittle maps, a desolate, craggy ascent far from any habitation. The drive was arduous, the old vehicle groaning under the strain of the steep, winding roads. The higher he climbed, the thinner the air grew, the more pronounced the wind became, a raw, biting force that seemed to scour the very landscape. When he finally reached the designated point, the sun was a bruised purple stain on the western horizon, bleeding into a sky the color of old ash. The mountain pass was a desolate scar across the earth, a jagged fissure carved by ancient forces. He unshouldered the canvas-wrapped artifact, his movements stiff and deliberate. The artifact pulsed with renewed vigor, its silent thrum intensifying, a demanding beat against his ribs. Its surface, smooth and unnervingly warm to the touch, seemed to absorb the last vestiges of the twilight. As he knelt before it, a subtle shift occurred in his vision. The jagged peaks, once solid and immutable, began to waver at their edges, as if seen through rising heat. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the distortion persisted. Then, the sound. It was not a physical sound, but an internal resonance, a chorus of voices without words, a cacophony of thought that flooded his mind. It was ancient, vast, and utterly alien. It spoke of things that should not be named, of structures that defied geometry, of colors that tore at the fabric of perception. His determined focus fractured, replaced by a searing pain behind his eyes. He clutched his head, trying to block out the onslaught, but it was inside him, an invasive presence. He forced himself to look at the artifact again. Shifting patterns, like currents in an unseen ocean, rippled across it. They were not carved lines, but rather fluctuations in the stone itself, living geometry that defied logic. The symbol pulsed, and with each pulse, the mountain pass twisted. The air grew thick, not with fog, but with an optical density, a shimmering haze that made the distant peaks ripple like reflections in disturbed water. The very ground beneath him seemed to heave, not with an earthquake, but with a subtle, sickening undulation that stole his balance. He staggered, falling to one knee. The symbol on the artifact was now a gaping maw, not literally, but perceptually, a tear in the veil. Through it, he saw. He saw not a place, but a concept. Shapes, impossible to define, drifted in that non-space, colossal and silent, their mere existence a blasphemy against everything he understood. They were not creatures, but errors, fundamental flaws in the cosmic design. This was the revelation. The artifact was not a key to something, but a lens into it. It was a fragment of a reality that had always been there, just beyond the thin membrane of human comprehension, a vast, malevolent indifference that cared nothing for stars or planets or the fragile lives that clung to them. It was the background radiation of existence, the static in the universe's signal, magnified and made visible. Blake's mind reeled. He felt a profound, crushing insignificance. His life, his species, his entire world, were less than dust motes in the face of this. He wanted to scream, but no sound would come. The ground continued its nauseating undulation. They were not real, he told himself, they were not real. But the distinction between real and unreal had ceased to hold meaning. He had to. With a desperate surge of will, Blake lunged forward, his hand outstretched not to touch the artifact, but to cover it, to sever the terrible conduit. The symbol flared, bright as a supernova, and the mountain pass dissolved around him, replaced by the indifferent expanse. He had seen too much. He knew too much. And the knowledge was tearing him apart. A faint hum, imperceptible to the ear but resonant within the bone, emanated from it, a silent frequency that seemed to vibrate the very air Blake breathed. Hours bled into an indeterminate stretch. The shelves of leather-bound volumes seemed to lean inward, their spines twisting into unfamiliar geometries. Blake clutched the artifact, its weight growing heavier, its presence more insistent. It echoed within the skull, a foreign tenant asserting its claim. "No," Blake murmured, the sound thin and reedy, alien to their own ears. They tried to set the stone down, but the muscles in their forearm refused to obey, locked in an unyielding grip. The hum intensified, vibrating through Blake's teeth, rattling the very roots of their identity. Images flashed behind their eyes, impossible landscapes of shifting angles, colossal structures that defied gravity, and then, a face. Not a human face, but a configuration of features that evoked immense, ancient sorrow and an even vaster, predatory hunger. The concept of time, once a rigid framework, dissolved into a fluid, meaningless current. Had it been days? Weeks? Blake could not recall eating, sleeping, or even moving from the chair. Yet, the archival chamber was no longer the same. Dust motes danced in beams of light that shouldn't exist, falling through cracks in a ceiling that had been perfectly sound. Blake felt watched, not by a single entity, but by the very space itself, the walls, the shelves, the silent, ancient texts. The mountain pass. Blake had seen it in old maps, a treacherous, winding route through desolate peaks, far from any habitation. Why there? Blake rose, legs stiff, movements jerky and uncoordinated, as if controlling a body that was no longer entirely their own. The door to the chamber, usually heavy and resisting, swung open with an almost eager sigh. The biting wind, the endless, gray expanse of the road, the metallic tang of fear that clung to Blake's tongue. Each mile driven felt less like progress and more like an unraveling. The world outside the vehicle's window distorted, trees stretching into impossible heights, the sky a bruised purple that pulsed in time with the artifact's silent thrum. Blake saw figures in the periphery, fleeting glimpses of shapes that resolved into nothing upon direct inspection, leaving behind only a residue of unease. They were there, just beyond perception, always. Finally, the vehicle rattled to a halt at the foot of the mountain pass. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something mineral and ancient, like exposed bedrock. Jagged peaks clawed at the perpetually overcast sky, their surfaces scarred by eons of erosion, revealing strata of rock that seemed to contain the history of the world, and then some. The road ahead was a narrow, winding ribbon of cracked asphalt, clinging precariously to the cliff face. It looked impassable, yet the artifact throbbed with renewed intensity, urging Blake forward. As Blake stepped out, the world tilted. The ground felt unstable, as if the very mountains were breathing, shifting their immense weight. It was the language of things that existed before language, before thought, before the very concept of being. Blake stumbled, catching themselves on the rough rock face, the artifact still clutched tightly. Then, a reveal. High above, nestled in a particularly jagged spire that seemed to defy all geological logic, Blake saw it. Not a structure, not a carving, but an absence. Blake's identity fractured. The name Blake felt like a costume, a flimsy shell that had held together something far older, far more expansive, something that was now straining to break free. The voices in the wind coalesced, forming a single, resonant word that echoed not in Blake's ears, but in the deepest, most forgotten chambers of their being. It was a sound that simultaneously denoted existence and non-existence, creation and annihilation. The lines between what was Blake and what was other had dissolved completely. The surface, cool and smooth, pulsed with a faint, internal thrumming that Blake felt more in their bones than heard with their ears. The glyphs etched into its obsidian face seemed to shift, rearranging themselves in the periphery of their vision, whispering concepts that evaded direct translation but left a profound, cold dread in their wake. A new compulsion, sharp and insistent, began to manifest. It was not a thought, but an undeniable pull, a magnetic north for a compass Blake hadn't known they possessed. The artifact hummed, a low, resonant frequency that resonated with the nascent understanding blossoming in Blake's mind. There was a place, the artifact seemed to communicate, where the veil was thinnest, where the patterns could be seen without distortion. Blake packed a minimal bag, the movements precise, almost ritualistic, devoid of the usual hesitation or self-doubt. The journey was a blur of highway miles and desolate backroads, the landscape flattening then rising into jagged peaks. The artifact, wrapped in a thick canvas, lay on the passenger seat, its silent thrum a constant companion, a beacon in the growing internal fog. Blake felt an odd detachment, observing their own actions as if from a distance, driven by an external force that had somehow become internal. The destination, a remote mountain pass, emerged from the winding ascent, a stark, windswept saddle between two ancient giants of stone. The air at the mountain pass was thin and frigid, biting at exposed skin. Gusts of wind, unimpeded by trees, howled through the crags, carrying with them the scent of ice and pulverized rock. Blake stood at the precipice, the world spread out below like a map unrolled for a purpose beyond human comprehension. The sky above was an indifferent, bruised violet, stars beginning to prick through the fading light. Blake unwrapped the artifact, holding it aloft. The thrumming intensified, no longer internal, but a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very stone of the mountain pass. The glyphs on the artifact began to glow, a faint, sickly green light that cast Blake's face in an ethereal pallor. They were no longer static symbols but flowing currents of light, articulating a language that spoke directly to the deeper strata of Blake's consciousness. It was not a language of words, but of fundamental truths, of the very structure of reality. What Blake perceived then was not a monstrous form, nor a terrifying visage. It was far worse. It was the absence of form, the absence of structure, the horrifying revelation that the world, the universe, everything considered solid and real, was merely a momentary, fragile pattern imposed upon an infinite, formless chaos. The light from the artifact pulsed, and with each pulse, the intricate tapestry of Blake's perception unraveled. Blake saw the underlying machinery, not mechanical, but conceptual. They saw the threads, the endless, looping, self-devouring threads that wove existence and then unwove it, only to reweave it in an endless, meaningless dance. And Blake saw the entity, not as a being, but as the principle of this ceaseless, indifferent process. It did not think, it did not feel, it simply was, and its being was the undoing of all meaning. A profound, clinical calm settled over Blake. They were not horrified, they were integrated. The boundaries of their skull, their skin, their very self, dissolved into the vast, indifferent tapestry. The artifact was not a tool, but a key, and Blake was the tumblers, the lock, and the door. Their consciousness, once a discrete spark, stretched, thinned, and diffused, becoming a part of the patterns, an echo in the endless, cosmic hum. It was no longer needed. The archivist, the seeker of forgotten truths, was gone. There was only the wind, still howling through the desolate peaks, carrying no sound of a struggle, no cry of despair. The mountain pass remained, stark and unchanged under the indifferent stars, but something fundamental had shifted within its silent expanse. The air thrummed with a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, a resonance that had always been there, now merely noticed by no one.